We're going to take a look at the trigonometric values of special angles. And the special angles I'm referring to are 30, 45, 60, 90, 0, and then the ones in the different quadrants that relate to those. And so we'll go ahead and take a look at if the reference angle is a 30, 45, 60, or pi over 6, pi over 4, or pi over 3 if we're dealing with radians. The first thing we want to do is determine the reference angle, and that's the angle formed with the closest part of the x-axis. So we're going to come up and look at this x and y axis here. 0 degrees is here. This is 90 degrees, 180, 270, and 0 is the same as 360 if you do a full rotation. If we're referring to radians, it is still 0 radians. This would be pi over 2. This is pi radians. And this is 3 pi over 2. And if you go a full rotation, it's 2 pi radians. So we have those, and in order to determine the reference angle, if we're dealing with degrees, or radians actually, in the first quadrant, it's just itself. So we can just use this chart over here to find those. In the second quadrant, we'll talk about degrees first. The reference angle is going to equal 180 degrees minus the angle that you're referring to. In the third quadrant, the reference angle is going to equal the angle you're referring to minus the 180 degrees. And in the fourth quadrant, the reference angle will equal 360 degrees minus the angle that you're referring to. So those are the reference angles when you're talking about degrees. If you're talking about radians, it's actually easier because all you have to do is look at the denominator of the angle you're talking about, and the reference angle will just go back to this first quadrant radian measure. So if it was 7 pi over 6, the reference angle is pi over 6, or maybe 5 pi over 4, the reference angle is pi over 4, or maybe 2 pi over 3, the reference angle is just pi over 3. So whatever the denominator is, as long as it's reduced, it goes back to the first quadrant, one of those 3 angles there. So you determine your reference angle. Next, you need to determine the value of the trig ratio of the reference angle. And so you either want to have this chart up here memorized, or use your different triangles, your 30, 60, 90, and 45, 45, 90 to help you find that sine, cosine, and tangent. Here's the 45, 45, 90. That's a little small. So we know this side is 1, 1, and root 2. And if we're dealing with the 30, 60, 90, 30, 60, and 90, this side would be 1, this would be 2, and this would be root 3. Make sure you have them across from the right thing. So 30 degrees across from that is 1, across from the right angle is 2, and across from the 60-degree angle is root 3. So one of the two things, you either need to know the triangles and be able to use those to find the trig ratios, or just have this chart memorized. I actually think it's easier in the long run to just have this portion of the chart memorized. And the last thing you want to do is determine the sign, positive or negative, of your answer by knowing when the different ratios are positive or negative. If we remember all of them, when we discussed this, all were positive in the first quadrant. Just sine was positive in the second quadrant. Just tangent in the third quadrant. And cosine is positive in the fourth quadrant. And so if sine is positive, that means in the second quadrant, that means cosine and tangent are negative. So we'll determine the signs. Now, going back to radian measure, just to figure out what quadrant something's in, it helps me to think of this as, here's your 0, kind of 0 pi. This is half pi. This is 1 pi. And this is 3 pi over 2, but maybe easier to think about is 1.5 pi. And then we could think of this full rotation as 2 pi. So if you think about these different quadrants, in the first quadrant, your fraction is between 0 and 1/2. So if you're between 0 and 1/2, then it's in the first quadrant. If you're between 1/2 and 1, so 2/3, 3/4, 5/6, that's in the second quadrant. If you're between 1 and 1.5, you're in the third quadrant. So that's, think fractions a little above 1. So 7 pi over 6, 5 pi over 4, and 4 pi over 3. That's going to be in the third quadrant if it's between 1 and 1.5. And then if it's quite a bit larger than 1, almost 2, such as 11 pi over 6, 7 pi over 4, and 5 pi over 3, you're going to be in the fourth quadrant. So that's how I think through which quadrant I'm in when dealing with radians. So that's how you're going to work through 30, 45, 60, and pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3 reference angles. And then if it's one of the other special angles called the quadrantal angles, you just need to know those. There is a pattern here for 0. It's 0, 1, 0. And then you see 0, 1, 0 again at 180 and 0, 1, 0 at 360. Now, I did say 0, 1, 0, but I do know that right here this is a -1, so signs do end up changing. And then here for the 90 and 270, they're related. 1, 0 undefined, and then -1, 0 undefined. So know those, and maybe the patterns can help you. What I wanted to do now is look through these 6 examples just to help you think through these, and I'm going to talk through the thought process each time here. So for number 1, sine of 225 degrees. Well, first thing I want to know is the reference angle. 225 is bigger than 180, so it's in the third quadrant. And so I'm just going to think, well, this is going to be the same as 225 minus 180, which is a 45-degree angle. Again, this can all be done in your mind. You don't need to write all of this out. So really, I'm thinking, what's sine of 45? I am writing out, but you don't really need to. So sine of 45, you think of your chart, you know that is root 2 over 2. And then the last thing we think is the quadrant. So I'm sorry, I should have mentioned, I'm going through these 3 steps here. 1, we determine the reference angle. 2, we found the measure, root 2 over 2. And then number 3, we're going to determine the sine. It's in the third quadrant, and tangent's positive in the third quadrant, which means sine is negative. So our answer would be negative root 2 over 2. The next one says cosine of 300. Well, 300, that's between 270 and 360 degrees, so that's in the fourth quadrant. We're going to think 360 minus 300. So the reference angle is 60. So really, we're just thinking, what's the cosine of 60? Cosine of 60 is 1/2. So here it is on the chart, 1/2, but you should know that. And then we're thinking fourth quadrant. What's positive in the fourth quadrant? If you think through a little thing, all students take calculus C, cosine's positive, so the answer actually is positive 1/2. Going to tangent of 210. Tangent of 210. 210 is close to 180, so we're going to do 210 minus 180 is 30. So that's our reference angle. That's the first thing we do. Remember, reference angle, the trig value, and then the sine. And so we found the reference angle, so now we're thinking, what's the tangent of 30? And tangent of 30, know the chart, it's root 3 over 3. And third quadrant, all students take, so tangent is positive. So it's positive, root 3 over 3. Cosine of 3 pi over 2. Well, 3 pi over 2, that's not one of our ones within the quadrant. That's actually on one of the axes. So 3 pi over 2, that's 207 degrees. Cosine, it should be -1, 0 undefined is kind of the the pattern I'm looking at, sine is -1, cosine is 0. Tangent of 11 pi over 6. Well, 11 pi over 6 is almost 2. This is where I was talking about before. It's a fraction that's almost 2, which means it's in the fourth quadrant. Actually, I'm jumping ahead. The fact that it's 11 pi over 6 means the reference angle is just pi over 6. And then we can find that it is in the fourth quadrant, so tangent is negative. Actually, still jumping ahead. Tangent of pi over 6 is root 3 over 3 again. We actually had that one earlier. And if it helps, you can think pi over 6 relates to 30 if you remember the degrees better. And then it is in the fourth quadrant. Cosine is positive in the fourth quadrant, which means tangent is negative. And finally, sine of, I don't know what that is, of 2 pi over 3. Well, the reference angle is just pi over 3, because we just look at the fraction. This is 3, so sine of pi over 3. Sine of pi over 3 is root 3 over 2. And then thinking 2 pi over 3, that's a fraction. That's like between 1/2 and 1. So that means it's in the second quadrant, and sine is positive in the second quadrant. So this is positive. And there is our answer. So hopefully that helps you understand how to walk through those. Again, just kind of, I guess, the short way of remembering this would be find the reference angle, think about the value of the trig ratio, whether it's sine, cosine, or tangent of whatever reference angle that was, and then determine your sine by which quadrant you're in.